Cheers. And welcome everyone to Winescapes with Artists. Our guest today is Michael Kenna. He really is a wine connoisseur. He's smelling his wine. I just sort of look at it and, and set it back down. So Michael, this is really a great opportunity to talk to you and see you again. It's been a while since we've been to your home and studio in Seattle area. And we were actually both in San Francisco in the Bay Area at the same time, many years ago. So it's, I really appreciate this opportunity to share your work with our listeners today, because I think you're one of the most important photographers in contemporary photography who are working with the landscape and creating a body of work that has that resonates throughout the 40 plus years that you've been working as an artist.
We can just stop there if you want.
Okay, I'm all done. That's good. And it was interesting because as I was pulling slide images, gathering some of your images to use for a slide presentation, first of all, you have so much work and all of it is fantastic. So it was actually hard for me to go through and pick, and finally I just said, it's all good. I mean, whatever I pick will be great. And the first groups of work that we'll look at are really meant to be looked at chronologically. It's not so much that I'm expecting you to talk about each image, but I thought we could use those images as we put them on the screen to talk about your background, your experience, and your way of working. And there you are. And I started with this one of the docs, Study 7, which is 1987. But even before we go there, I think it's important for people to understand your background. And in your case, I can't think of any other artist that I've talked to where I bring up their religious background. And in your case, it's important because I think it does inform the artist that you are, and it informs your approach to your work. You were born in Great Britain. You were from an Irish Catholic family, and you even had your sights on the priesthood, if I'm reading correctly on your background, and went to seminary school fairly young. And from there, after a number of years, you left and went to art school. So right there, perhaps on the surface, a major change, but do you want to talk about the impact that early training had and that kind of faith-based education, and then the transition to art school?
Absolutely. Yes, I was born and brought up in Widnes, and in an Irish Catholic family. I do remember that the local Catholic priest was the highest, most important, most dignified, most celebrated kind of character, along with the rugby league players. So
that balances out very nicely.
It wasn't surprising in many ways. I was an altar boy. I loved the kind of the mysteries of serving on the altar, the rituals. It didn't matter whether it was Holy Communion or a funeral. It was all absolutely fascinating for me. I just loved hanging out in the local church. So when I got to be about 10 years old, it really was a matter of, shall I become a rugby league player or shall I become a Catholic priest? All the others were not so interesting for me. And I really wanted to become a Catholic priest. And I think, when we look forward then into the photography and what I do these days, much of what I look for, and people often say this, is the kind of the enigmatic, what is not really seen, the almost the haiku aspect of suggestion. I always say, well, it can come from many things, but in my case, I think it's because I did spend those hours and days later, because I went to a seminary school and studied to be a priest for 7 years. But the idea in Catholicism is that there is a light on the altar which symbolizes the presence of a God, basically. And in my boyhood, I fervently believed in this, and And so just this single light suggested so much, this whole other universe, everything that we couldn't really see, but that I fervently believed in. And I think it's, it became a part of my character. So now when I photograph, and and the 45 years I've been photographing, I'm always looking for what is not quite visible, which is somewhat enigmatic in a strange way, because photography is all about photographing the visible. And people say, why do you photograph at night? Or why do you do long exposures? Why do you photograph in the mist? Why rain? And it's often because I'm trying to obscure what is immediately visible and try to kind of suggest what is behind the veil, what is there at night, or with the long exposures, what happens during 4 or 5 hours, how things change. I'm interested in what, in a sense, we can't see with the visible eye, but what is obviously there.
Well, you're still a priest, because you're creating images where you want the viewers to go on a journey of discovery, where you want them to have an emotional experience, where you want them to begin to embrace that which isn't visible. So so your work isn't really about religion, but it's about all of those other things of faith, of spirit, of emotional response, that I think is really quite powerful, and less about the document than it is about, as you said, haiku or poetry in the visual image.
Yes, I think it is very much about the journey. I mean, I'm still waiting for the ordination. I haven't been ordained.
We'll do a write-in campaign for you. How's that?
When I went to seminary school, I'm working on a book right now about that time in my life, which was very, very important for me. And literally, you would spend hours and days sometimes in absolute silence on spiritual retreats. And I remember after 3 days of being silent, why do we have to talk? I love being quiet. You can begin to listen and hear, and you can have a conversation with your sense in a sense. And when I go photographing, it's not so different. I like to be quiet. I like to be solitary whenever it's possible. Often I need a guide and so forth. But that idea of not having constant chatter and distraction is very, very central to my work, I think.
So, and we'll probably come back and forth to this idea, but in this image and then the one following it, I selected not only because they were early, but they demonstrated that you can make something beautiful out of the docks. And also, I think this demonstrates the long exposure. You can see the stars moving across the sky. Do you remember what exposure length this was?
It's probably about 20 minutes, judging by the length of the lines. You can imagine if it takes a whole full circle, then it's 24 hours. But I don't know for sure. I never really recorded. It was very much trial and error basis at that point.
Could we go to the next slide? So the power stations. And again, I think you're the only artist I know that can make power stations beautiful. And you did a whole series of these. This is study number 17. So was it the form that drew you? Was it the power of what they represented?
As in most of these images, there's a long story behind everything. But I came from a very industrial part of England. So, the previous one of the docks, that's, it's not a very typical sort of landscape for me, this industrial landscape. But when I first went to art school, going back, that priesthood thing didn't quite work out. I hit puberty and decided, maybe not such a great idea. I wasn't very good at anything except art. So it was natural, and I went on to an art school, which is where I really came across photography. So for the first 5 or 6 years of my photographic career as such, I was very much following a path of looking for the beautiful, the inspirational, the atmospheric, and that was in the landscape. Eventually, I kind of turned full circle. I was very much influenced by Bill Brandt. I loved his industrial landscapes, and I went to, particularly in 1986 when he died, I went looking for his industrial landscapes. And on the way up to the north of England, I would pass this power station, and I began to photograph it as in many of my projects, without a clue what I was doing. It was a kind of a trial and error basis. Looking back, I see now that there were power stations all around me in Widnes. It was a very natural form for me. After a number of years of photographing industrial subject, I realized that beauty is very much in the mind of the beholder, and beauty is all around us. It's what we do with it. Obviously, power stations comes with its certain ominous aspect of pollution and everything else that comes with that. But if I look at it just as forms, they resemble, Arnaldo, Pomodoro, beautiful kind of just gorgeous sculptures in the landscape. And every time I went to this place, it would change. It was never the same, which is a kind of an Eugene Auger lesson for me, that, you can go to the same place over and over again and you'll always find something different. So depending on the wind, the weather, the conditions, my state of mind, my jet lag, I would have different photographs, whether I was photographing during the day or photographing at night. And this is a project that went on from the mid-80s, really, until about 2000 or so. And it would have continued, but then they started kicking me out because they thought I was a terrorist because I happened to have a camera with me. The whole climate changed after a certain while. I couldn't get near the power station anymore.
Yeah. So next slide. So traveling became really, you traveled to photograph. And I assume that part of that was just a fascination with the world around you. But certainly there were countries like France that you still go back to and photograph.
Yes, I love to travel. I've always loved to explore, and the more places I get to, the happier I am. Right now, it's a strange time where we're not allowed to go anywhere, but it's fine. I have lots to do here. But yes, I started traveling from my base in England and UK and started moving out to Europe. So most of my early work was European influenced. My favorite photographers were all European at the time. And I photographed wherever I could. Paris is very close to England, of course. And I began to work with whatever forms I saw around me. I never felt that there was anything that I needed to avoid, in terms of cliches. I've often been asked, how can you photograph the Eiffel Tower? Everybody photographs the Eiffel Tower. And I say, well, why not? And how about sunrises and sunsets? They're so cliches, but they're absolutely gorgeous. And every time you see one, it's different. It goes back to the power station. So for me, the Eiffel Tower was just one more subject that I photographed. I did a whole project on Le Nôtre's gardens.
Can we my vision is always.
Oh yeah, sorry. Oh yeah, look at that. Very good. You're ahead of the game here. So I particularly early on, I found that I was inspired by other photographers, and I went on the hunt essentially for where they photographed. So Eugene Auger, I mentioned before, he photographed in and around Paris all his life. So I went to photograph these gardens, looked for his influence. I was very interested in optical illusions, and I found a lot of them in the Le Nôtrean gardens. And I spent a number of years photographing these places. I kept going back, so I've had a number of books on this particular subject matter. So
a couple of things that we should mention, as obvious as they are, you work in black and white. Everything is black and white. And you, actually I had another one, but it just floated right out of my head. So you work in black and white, and you are drawn to, again, this kind of long exposure, or the fact that there's no real shadows. It's all about the time of day, the muted sky. And yet, by this time you were living in the Bay Area, correct? In San Francisco?
1998, yes, I was.
So California has a lot of sun. So that's a good excuse to travel and make these pictures. But black and white seems to be key to your, to the kind of work that you do, so that you can see these forms, these shapes that emerge around you.
Yes, I mean, I'm interested in this muted palette. It's not that I have anything against color. I just find it's too vibrant. It reveals too much details. It goes back to this kind of the essence of almost purification, simplification, haiku again. As soon as it's in black and white, it's not reality. It's an interpretation of reality, and we require a certain usage of our own imaginations and experiences to create and to finish the image, in a sense. As soon as it's black and white, there's space for the imagination to go into these scenarios and wander around. I find that color, I mean, we're seeing color all the time, of course, everything is in color. It's just, for my palette, vision, sense, whatever it is, it goes to the kind of the quiet elements and to these kind of more muted aspects of the landscape.
Next slide. And then, of course, Japan. And so I picked a number of photographs from Japan. First, I kind of share your passion for Japan. It's a country that I've been back to many, many, many times. And there is a sensibility to the landscape, the history, the age that is so much a part of the country and the aesthetics around you anywhere that you look. This is Hokkaido, which is a little bit more rough and ready in some ways, but with the snow that, as with the hillside fence that you show here, is to me such a perfect example of your vision and Japanese aesthetic.
Yes, I started going to Hokkaido in the mid 80s. I was absolutely fascinated for it. This is, in fact, the first time I came across Buddhist sculpture when I went to Kyoto and Nara. I found that I went back a number of times because I was invited for various exhibitions and books, book signings, book publications. It wasn't really till 2000, 2001 that I began to have this real strong desire to get out of the cities and explore the landscape. And I have been ever since, essentially. It wasn't until 2002 that I went up to northern Japan, to Hokkaido. Hokkaido is, you know, particularly in the winter, it's just this glacial, white, almost blank screen, you know, something called sumie painting, ink painting, which always reminded me. And I found, without consciously working on it, that my palette had completely transformed and changed. Whereas coming from this European background and kind of Bill Brandt addict, I always saw the world somehow as being very, very dark with shapes coming out of it. And now I saw the world as white with things being put on it somehow. It was kind of a 180-degree shift somehow. And I found that my work became more and more simple. It became even more haiku than it had been before. I was working with similar forms sometimes, very, very simple. Transitions of space, optical illusions again. But here, this fence, for example, I photographed this. I think this is in 2002. I can't really see, but again, it's still there. I keep going back to it almost every year. I have maybe 10 or 15 studies of it now, and it's always a little bit different, transforms, changes. It's very, very simple. And each time I photograph this fence, it's always, you're dealing with very simple kind of ink marks, almost kanji characters on a white canvas. And throughout Hokkaido, throughout the work I've done there, my work has become more and more kind of sparse, fewer elements, much more to the imagination than before.
Well, you've reached a mastery of your craft and your vision, which is this refinement to these very, very simplified elements. So while it may appear to be less, it's really much, much more. Why don't we go to the next slide? So again, the same kind of lightness that you were talking about, and these kinds of elemental trees that were placed in there. Next slide. So this one has a little bit different feel. I think we're getting
sorry, somebody was calling me. Yes.
Okay.
No, I don't know much about this Zoom thing.
Okay.
The slide does not come up on my screen, but that's okay. I think it was one of 7.
It's Rocks on Water from Okinawa. And
Ah, there it is. Yes, I see it.
Yes.
Yes. So it was interesting. Sorry, I got distracted with this phone, or horrible phone call. That's why I think phones should be banned in our civilization. So the last one of the 7 trees
Okay.
was interesting for me because that was actually photographed in the south of Japan in boiling heat at midday. And when I was saying my vision was transformed somewhat from being in the north, when I began to photograph at night in the mid 80s, that also transformed my palette because I found that I began to make images made during the day that looked as though they were at night. Because we did that night work book together when we were at Friends of Photography.
Right.
And then I found also my night photographs I sometimes printed as though they were at day. So now I found that being in the north of Japan was influencing everything that I photographed. So here in the south, it's bright blue sky, blue water, and I'm trying to make it look as though they're cold, they're in snow somehow, they're kind of frozen, but it's not the case at all. And it really is very much up to the photographer to interpret what is in front of them or what they feel, how they sense it, how they experience it. I'm sure another photographer would photograph this scene completely differently and would see it completely differently. But my vision at the time had been shaped by my experience in the north. So we can go
go ahead.
So we can go to the next image if you want.
Yeah. And I also wanted to talk about the fact that you print your own work.
I do. I've just come up from the darkroom. I've been in the darkroom since 5:30 this morning.
And how much manipulation do you do in the darkroom?
Well, let's look at an image like this one here, for example. I mean, if you look at that, I mean, this almost looks like a digital image. In fact, it's not. It's a silver print from a silver negative. It's just a very, very long exposure, so the clouds are moving. So one always has the option of, in a sense, controlling, manipulating, directing a viewer to areas where you want the viewer to go to. So in this case, there's not much information in the foreground. There's not much information in the sky. This is a very, very basic image in many ways, insofar as there's a progression from dark to light, which is a natural progression in photography. We go from dark to light. So immediately we create a foreground, which is dark, and a background, which is light. So in a sense, you're in a tunnel that you can't get out of. It's almost claustrophobic. That is done in the darkroom for the most part, because naturally it doesn't occur like this. Clouds don't necessarily go from white to black in such a small area. What is fascinating about photography is it's almost like clay, that you can mold it and manipulate it and play with it and move it around. And when you're in the darkroom, you're constantly doing this. You're creating dark areas and light areas and cropping and shaping. And often I print things upside down or back to front, or just so I can see them in a more abstract manner.
So Ansel Adams, when he printed in the darkroom, would create what he called recipe cards, where he would make little drawing sketches and show where he burned and dodged and kept notes, so that when he went back to print again, he would know what he did. Do you do something similar?
I was in my days of being influenced by Ansel and the whole California school of photography. I did used to create these quite detailed renderings of how I had printed something, which enlarger or what paper or what chemicals and so forth. And then maybe 15 years ago, I threw 4 or 5 binders of these things away because I actually didn't like going back and looking at this and saying, well, how did I print this? I need to do it the same way. Mm-hmm. I went through this phase of saying, no, I really, in truth, when you print something for the 3rd or 4th time, it's pretty boring. It's not very creative, because you're trying to emulate what you've done, either 6 months ago or 10 years ago, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. What I like to do now is just have the negative. I know what the print looked like before. Often I have my artist-proof backup print. But I don't feel that I need to slavishly do the same print, imitate it in a sense. So now I leave myself very basic notes of where I burned and dodged, which I sometimes recall. But I don't feel that I have to make the same print again. So in a sense, I threw all my recipe cards away at a certain point. Sometimes I regret that. How on earth did I print this? I have no idea. But I like the idea that we can, we can maintain the excitement of the negative and make a new rendition if need be, a new interpretation.
So digital is out of the question for you.
I know it sounds strange, but it's just in a sense, it's too easy. It's like playing the guitar with GarageBand or something. It doesn't work for me. I mean, I've played with it. I've experimented. I've had companies give me cameras for a while and say, see what you can do with it. And I've ended up just, throwing all the files out. Mm-hmm. The prints I don't know what it is exactly, but I don't like the instant gratification. I like not really knowing what I'm getting. Going back to those, religious days as such, there's a very famous theologian named Paul Tillich who says that doubt is central to faith, which for me translates into my photography world that I never really want to pre-visualize. It's against the kind of the opposite of Ansel in a sense. Mm-hmm. I don't really want to know what I'm getting. I want to always have that doubt whether I've actually got anything, And in a sense, that drives me on, that dissatisfaction, that not quite knowing, keeps me going, keeps me saying, well, there must be another interpretation. There must be a different way of looking at this. Even though I've already got, some photographs already made, let's just keep looking. Let's keep, and, I have a phone, I can make iPhone pictures and I can see, sometimes I do it and I crop it, so yeah, that's pretty good. But even that works against me to a degree, because it gives me a degree of, okay, that's done. I can go on to something else. Mm-hmm. And I don't really like that. I like the feeling that it's never quite done, and it's a constant process, and there are more interpretations possible.
Yeah, limiting the process is not fulfilling. It really is, again, that journey that you need to take as the artist, from being in the location to, taking a picture, to processing, to printing, to really be able to engage with it. Can we go to the next slide?
It's a very slow process. There's the silver printing, but it's a process that I absolutely love from start to finish. I never really know it's like when I get the negatives back, it's Christmas. It's like, oh, really? Did I do mine? Oh, look at that! What a surprise! It's great.
So we have the fishing.
Yes.
Rods, but we can continue. Again, and then we're back to France in 2009.
Yes, this is in Versailles. One of the bonuses of being in this game for so long, photographing for so long, is that people allow you in places now. Mm-hmm. So I very fortunately have been able to go to a place like Versailles and spend the night there, and just wander around the garden in the middle of the night and leave cameras out in different places, which has been wonderful. So this is in the middle of the night in Versailles.
And so you set up more than one camera at a time, so you can take
I often
pictures.
Do that. Yes,
okay.
Yes. I set cameras up. Sometimes I do that when I'm in Hokkaido. Before I go to sleep, I'll set a camera up, or two cameras in different places, and I'll just wake up an hour before dawn and take the cameras. And I never know what's on the cameras. Sometimes, 9 out of 10, it's useless. It's either you have condensation, or a car has gone by, or there's some strange lines, or something has happened. But occasionally you get these, again, as I say, Christmas presents, these amazing events that you had no idea what was going on. And it's that feeling of life happening regardless of whether you're watching it, looking at it, photographing it. It's happening all the time around you.
And so the Hasselblad works well in the cold?
Yeah, I mean, it works well because I have the basic Hasselblads. Again, digital is a little different. It's got a lot of electronics. Batteries wear out. Things, electronics go haywire. The Hasselblad is a bit like an old lawnmower. It's got very basic parts. Mm-hmm. Condensation is one of the hardest things to avoid. But other than that, it doesn't have any batteries. Doesn't have any meters. Doesn't have any electronics. It's so the worst that happens is it gets wet. And then I dry it in the morning, or I use a different body or a different lens or a different back. I always travel with at least 2 camera bodies and a bunch of lenses and a lot of camera backs.
Next slide. And I picked this one mostly because I collect 19th century photographs of the pyramids.
Oh,
And
great.
so I really enjoyed this. And
Mhm.
while and it references the gardens as well, the
Yes.
shapes that you
Mhm.
were interested in. And also it's a good point to talk about the fact that your work tends not to have people in it.
Mhm.
And so the next body that we'll talk about, the Rafu, is something that's distinctly different.
All
So if we
right.
could go
Yes.
to the next slide.
Mhm.
So can you talk about the nudes? And for a number of people, this work may come as a surprise, something that they're not as familiar with in your body of work.
Yes, I mean, I'm known as a landscape photographer as such, but of course, in the space of 45 years, you tend to photograph many different subject matters. When I was in photography school, the body itself was fascinating for my senior thesis was on stroboscopic body motion, a bit like Harold Edgerton, and it was with lots of colors. But this was in the 70s, this was in the hippie era, so I had stroboscopic lights and all sorts of stuff.
Psychedelic.
In the 70s, when I was in San Francisco, I was very fortunate to be the printer for Ruth Bernhard, and I worked with Ruth for 10 years. Of course, she photographed the female body for the most part, and lots of other things. And she was highly inspirational to my work. But she was also quite intimidating. If you're working with a master of the female body, it's very difficult to, and I was, also really fascinated with travel, with landscape, with everything else. So in a sense, my interest in photographing in the human body kind of was put to one side. I was very happy to print her work. I learned a great deal from her, but I didn't really pursue it very much. And then my career really, it began to take off. It began to take off in certain directions. And when you look at that pyramid one, I was going to mention that I had two kind of career paths in many ways. I was also a commercial photographer as well as working through galleries. Mm. And the good part about that, many of the good parts, was location. They say location, location, location. So the last one was photographed for a major bank. And I was able to have access to that location at a certain time when there was no people, which helped that no people thing. So getting back to this area. So I've been photographing in Japan for many, many years. And I thought, well, maybe I'll pick up this project again of photographing the human body. And in Japan, there's this kind of a slightly different aspect about wandering around with no clothes on. For Japanese, it's quite normal. We share communal baths and so forth. And so the people I worked with, my agents, my guides, and so they all had friends who were office workers, yoga people, dancers, just whatever. And they were all very, very eager and very happy to participate in this project. And so when I was going over to photograph the landscape, I would set aside 1 or 2 days and photograph with models in various Japanese locations. And, I think I photographed the models in very much the same way as I photographed the landscape, with a certain amount of respect, a certain amount of reserve, distance. But I'm working with these organic shapes, which is for me very much like the world, and these kind of human-made structures, so these geometric lines. Normally it would be, moving shapes, water, trees, earth, sky, clouds, whatever, against, buildings, structures, whatever it else. But here is the human body that I was working with against these structural shapes. And I did this project over perhaps a period of 10 years, made maybe, thousands of images, printed 100 and had an exhibition in Tokyo last year. So this one is this is a modern dancer who has beautiful, long shape. And this is one of these kind of altars that, I can't remember the name of the word, that a lot of Japanese people have in their homes. So she is kind of sitting on this strange shape and using this amazing body to go around these very, very geometric human-made shapes.
Could we have the next slide? And again, very similar to the landscapes. Yes. That you were talking about in terms of the lighting, in terms of the form, and that's what was so wonderful about this body of work is its connection to the environment that you have.
Yes, I mean, I didn't really see it as being very different from everything else I photographed, and I photographed it in the same way insofar as I didn't bring in artificial constructs. I didn't, light the models. I used whatever I saw, and it was absolutely wonderful working with the models, because there were all sorts of different people. Some of them, were happy just doing their own thing, moving all over the place. Others stood there and said, "Okay, what do I do next?" So it was a wonderful project.
Let's go to the next slide. This takes us to the Buddha series. And I wanted to talk about the Buddhas and also confessionals. And because for me, they feel very similar. They don't look similar, but they feel similar in what they represent. So clearly in your travels, and again, the Buddhas are from a number of different Asian countries, Japan, Cambodia, Korea. And if you want to talk about how you got started with the Buddhas.
It was that first trip to Japan in 1987 when I went to Kyoto and Nara and walked into my first Buddhist temples. And, was very struck in some, there's such similarities to my, religious upbringing. When I talk about being in a church, for example, with a certain reverence, respect for, what is not visible, certain discipline, there's an atmosphere, you can feel the vibrations of the place. You can smell the fragrance of the incense. There's kind of echoes of rituals that have taken place. So, I find that ever since, my childhood, I've always loved to go to buildings, structures, places where rituals take place, reverence. And that can be mosques or synagogues or shrines or chapels or temples, whatever it is. The religion, in a sense, is not so important to me. It's kind of that respect, that reverence, that aspect that there's something happening that in a sense I don't know about and I want to know about.
Next slide.
I started going to Kyoto, and then over the years I've just continued gravitating to Buddhist and also Shinto shrines in Japan. I photographed a lot of. And then, just a few years ago, essentially, my publisher in Germany, Prestel, said, we should do a book on your Buddhas. Oh, sorry.
So we're going to look at a couple of double-page spreads from the book. But so if we could go to the next Buddha. So Cambodia, I believe.
I mean, I photographed in many, many different countries, and some of it's a bit like when we get to the confessions, I'll talk about that. Some of it is in these countries, I'm drawn to the dawn, the dusk, the kind of the softer light, and the brutal midday heat often drives me indoors. So in Italy, it was with the rain would take me indoors, and I began to photograph the interior structures of a church, which took me to confessionals. In the same way, in these Asian countries, often I spend the daytime wandering around inside, Buddhist temples and photographing whatever I happen to see in there, and that includes these beautiful Buddhist statuary.
Next slide.
And sometimes we talk about a Hasselblad. I also use Holga cameras too, which is this nice plastic camera, because it gives this strange kind of vignetted, slightly out of focus, dreamlike quality, and many of my Buddha statues are with the Holga. So
next slide. So talk to me about the confessionals, because I wasn't familiar with this work, and so as we were getting ready for this conversation, I was very pleasantly surprised to see this work, and again, visually it's different than the landscapes, than the Buddha statues, but at the same time, the strong structure, it's about ritual, and it's about searching for one's inner self, I guess. um, not having grown up in the same religion and having to confess, there seems to be something fairly powerful about this, that even though I can't, from a personal experience, relate to that level of it, but just the idea of these as objects are really fascinating.
A lot of my work is also about memories and traces and what is left behind, kind of the resonance of a place, the echoes. And of course, I spent a lot of my childhood going into confessionals and confessing my sins, which I had to make up on the spur of the moment. But but these little boxes, which you find in all Catholic churches everywhere. In Italy, they're more historic. When I think about them, when I began to photograph them, the stories that have been told inside these, amazing. And so, I've photographed in and it may be strange to compare it, but for example, when I photographed in concentration camps, I photographed a lot of the minutiae of the concentration camp also, because it felt like there were stories and aspects that it's a bit like going back to Hokkaido, where they become catalysts for our imagination and for what happened. When I photographed my daughter's kindergarten class for many, many years. And again, it's just, there's small aspects, and each one of those aspects, whether they're toys or beeswax, dolls, whatever, they all have this presence, this history, this feeling that stories have taken place, and that fascinates me. So in the Buddhist statuary also, it's kind of that resonance, that historic, that patina of age is really tracks me. So back to the confessionals. These places are kind of the residuals of people's memories, of people's stories, of people's history, and structurally they're amazing. They're all completely unique, hand carved, uniquely made, and they're under our nose kind of all the time. They're every day. You go in and you see them every day. They're in this church, and when I really concentrated on them, I realized how absolutely precious and unique they are. When I worked with Ruth, she would always say, "Oh, you should really photograph within 10 feet of your bed, because you take things for granted, and you really need to train yourself to see things, the uniqueness of things that are right there." And I'm wandering around these churches saying, "Yeah, these are absolutely incredible." So I began to photograph them in the same way as, in a sense, going back all the way to the power stations. I photographed these structures, and knowing that each structure has its unique history and story to tell. And then it became a project, then it became an exhibition, then it became a book, and then, these things have a life of their own after a while.
I'm going to want to talk about books in a minute, but I also want to talk about scale. Most of your work you print fairly, 8 by 10?
Yes, yeah. It's about 8 by 8. Yeah.
Yeah. So the intimacy that one has. So basically, you go against everything that contemporary art is pushing at people, which is big, color, die-bound mounted plexi, all of those kinds of things. There is a quality, there is an intimacy with the scale, and the fact that it is chemical-based, black and white work that is really, I think, is part of the whole experience of viewing your imagery.
I think it's, I really think it's, I like what I like, it's, when it
we
comes,
like it too.
Yeah, when it comes down to it, it's not that I'm upset with everything else that's going on around, or digital, or big things, or color, or all this sort of stuff. It's, it's great, it's wonderful for it, but everybody should choose what works for themselves. Yeah. And this, I love the intimacy. I love for people to look inside the images rather than out at something. I like the connection, particularly, in this, it's amazing in this virus age, we can't get anyone, we have to be 6 feet away from people. And that's, that is in many ways how we're looking at artworks. We're looking at these big things. And I like to be 6 inches away. I like people to look at prints, and because that's the way I look at them. When I'm in an exhibition or whatever, I look at them from a distance, but then I go close up and I inspect the corners and I look into the details. It's kind of, I explore, wander around the rectangle. And that's, you know, that's just a wonderful way of experiencing a photographic print. I just find when I make them bigger, the bigger they are, the more distance people are from the print. They're not as engaging or physically present anymore. So I've in a sense always done this, and I've created this extended happy family that, you know, if I have exhibitions, whatever, I can show work from 1975, 1973 alongside 2020.
Mm-hmm.
They're
Next
happy
slide.
next to each other, you know. Ah, yes. Like many of the confessionals in Italy, they're under construction right now.
Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
So this is from the PDF that you sent of your upcoming book.
Yes.
And we wanted to, first of all, let people know about it, but also to show some of the double page spreads and talk about your relationship to showing your work in book form, because you have brought out, what, over 20 books?
I hate to say it's over 70 at this point.
70, sorry. But that's great, because again, it's a way of getting people to look at the work. Could we have the next slide? In ways that are different than just looking at individual images. So when is this book coming out?
It was printed last week, in fact. So it should be around mid-June into July.
Okay.
Everything has been delayed, put back because of the virus situation, transport and printing factories and so forth. But it is actually printed now, because I haven't seen the proofs, but
next slide.
It is printed, so it'll get here.
So the reason I wanted to show this is because of the fact that you've put two different subject matters together, seemingly different subject matters together, so that they speak to one another. And that's one of the things that I think you can do in a book very well, because they're there. You place them very deliberately. This wasn't an arbitrary choice on your part. And so can we go to the next slide so that people have a reference? And again, which side it's on, so that you're responding to work from one side to another. I think books are powerful in how people can engage with work. And so for you, how important is it to kind of revisualizing, rethinking your work as you put them together in a book?
I think it's extremely important, but I should give the credit to Prestel, who brought this book out, because they did all the placement of this one.
Okay.
Which is great. And I'll preface that by saying that because I've done so many books, I know that I have a certain predictable way of laying out, paginating books. I know that. I've paginated so many of my own books that I'm fighting against myself at this point. When I talked about really not liking pre-visualization, I know as a working artist that you tend to get into these patterns, and you have to break out of them, because eventually they lead you down a dead end, I think. So for many of my most recent books, I've specifically asked the publisher, I said, here's the work, this is what I have, you put it together. And relinquishing control or designating somebody else to be in control, and that's happened with many books recently, has been quite wonderful for me, because other people see your work very differently than you see yourself, and they produce juxtapositions that you wouldn't even think of. I don't always like them, I don't always completely agree with them, but I'm very, very happy that somebody else brings their spirit and their judgment and their kind of aesthetic sense into the equation, and it kicks me off my straight and narrow in a sense. So these, yes, occasionally I do, there are some things I do object to. I don't like, for example, full bleeds of pages, because it means my images get cropped, and there were a lot of full bleeds, and eventually I said, no, I can't live with this. It upsets me every time I turn the page, and they respected that, and they went back and redid things. Sometimes I would say, well, I think the big one should be the small one should be the big one, things like that. But generally, I allowed somebody else to paginate this particular book.
Next slide. So I really like this pairing too,
Yes.
by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So did you select the images, both sets of images, and then let them match, or they just took from
Essentially,
everything?
I said, here's 150 Buddhas or their, equivalent, whatever they have. And I think probably about 70 were selected for this. And then the person responsible for choosing, which was Iris Sturman, I've just realized, she chose the images. So she has a gallery in Munich, and she was the one I worked with on the image selection of the landscapes. And she essentially went to my website and looked, if it's in Laos or Myanmar or in Cambodia, whatever it is, and she looked at what are the other landscapes I had and selected some landscapes to go with it. Again, occasionally I would say, well, I prefer this image to that image and so forth, but somebody else did this for me, which is great.
Next slide.
Both in Korea. Yes, it's in Korea. And they're many years apart sometimes. So it has been quite wonderful for me to go back to images from, I don't know when these are, can't read it, but.
I can't either. So it's just 2011 and 2007.
Yes, that Golden Maitreya one I just printed a few days ago too. Yeah.
And do we have one more? Or was that the final?
That was the final one.
Okay. So with that, I'd like to take some questions if people have them. So can we unmute folks? And does anyone have? Oh, I wanted to be able, a couple of things I wanted to let you know, that Michael's work is available through Peter Fetterman Gallery in Los Angeles.
Yes, yes, Santa Monica, yes.
And so we can, and he knows to expect your call if you want to get work. So Peter's, I'm sure, waiting at the phone to hear from everybody. So any questions? I'm going to go through and call some people just to see if they want to make some comments. Joe.
Well, I'll make
Connie, okay.
Michael, I used to live in San Francisco, so it was easy for me to go down to Carmel for the day.
Oh, wonderful. Hi, Connie.
And this was years ago. And the first image of yours that I saw, probably at either Western Gallery or Photography West, I'm not sure, was a swing.
Yes, yeah, 1977, that image.
77?
Yep.
And I just said, wow, that is gorgeous.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful work. I love all of yours. And I love your power stations.
Thank you. Very kind.
I'm going to call on Peter Fetterman just so that people can, Peter?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you. Thank you for being online with us. And what is the best way for people just to, if they're interested, to go to Michael's website and figure out what they're interested in and then contact you?
Yeah, they can go to Michael's website or our website, which is peterfetterman.com, and just shoot us an email and we will respond quickly and confirm all details, availability, pricing, etc., etc.
Very good.
We've got to keep Michael busy.
I know.
Busy and funded so he can go to even more places.
Drinking too much wine these days.
Oh, I hear somebody yelling. So let's see, who else do we have there? Let's see. Oh, John Mullen, do you have some questions or comments you'd like to share with us?
This is Edith Kodner. I don't know if you can hear me.
Absolutely, Edith. Hi.
It's totally innocuous. I've loved your work for many years, I think going back to the 70s. And I'm sitting at my desk, I'm pointing right now, and looking at your image of Mont Saint-Michel, which happens to be one of my favorite places on earth.
Wonderful.
And with that mysterious fog, you may have done other images, but that's the image I have here. Oh, it's glorious. All your work is. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. Very kind.
Michael, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Fine,
Brian
okay.
Kelly, how are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good. My question is, I mean, you've been doing this for many, many years. Your work is stunning. It's inspirational. And I was curious about when you did start, how did you get into showing your work in a gallery and so forth? What was your big beginning?
Well, like most things, I was very lucky. So I came to the States in the late 70s. I was very fortunate to find work with Ruth Bernhardt. There was a gallery in San Francisco called the Stephen Wirtz Gallery that I stumbled upon, and they began to represent me. A gallery in Los Angeles called the Stephen White Gallery also began to represent me. But essentially, like most, former students who are starting off, I had a small portfolio and I pounded the pavements. I knocked on every gallery that I could think of and tried to show them my work. And very, very slowly as time progressed, a few galleries picked up my work, very few sales happened. I won an award in San Francisco called the Imogen Cunningham Award in 1981, which was something of a breakthrough because it gave me some press. And then I just continued ever since.
Yeah, your work is beautiful. I absolutely love it. And interestingly, when you talk about your format being in contemporary terms, everybody's big and large in color, and your pictures are very intimate, and it draws you in to really pause and look and kind of connect with the artwork.
Thank you. Yes, I like to think of them as little magnets that that attracts your attention.
Are you living in the States now?
I am. Yes, I'm up in Seattle now. Yes.
Oh, okay. Very good.
I've been here really since the 70s, late 70s.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Still have your accent.
A little bit. Depends.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, this is Bob Mackey.
Hey, Robert.
Michael, yeah, I was privileged to visit you at your studio, your home.
Very good, yes.
When
yes.
MOPA went there, and as many of the images I have here now, the idea of hearing your story in your own studio and purchasing the prints from you, it just makes them so much more intimate, as well as being small and intimate, to see them on my wall, because it harkens back to meeting you, and I love hearing the stories of your passion, and it makes a big difference when you view the image over the years. I think just
it's always nice to have a personal connection to any artwork you have, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been following Peter Fetterman's Power of Photography series. He sends out this one image every day in which he attaches a personal anecdote to each image. It makes them just so much more fascinating, even though the image is very, very powerful in itself. Just to add that little extra personal note makes a huge difference.
It's a great idea.
Okay. While we wait for someone else to ask a question or make a comment, what brought you to San Francisco? That's a big leap.
Well, when I was a student in England, I had on my wall a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge for all the time I was a student. And when I first came to the States, I worked in upstate New York in a hotel, making beds, cleaning the pool, doing, the stuff you do when you're a student. And I thought, my dream was to go to San Francisco. And I hitchhiked across the country, the United States. And my ride took me to Nogales on the Mexican border. And I remember thinking, well, I really need to head north to San Francisco. But there was a bus going to Mexico City. And I thought, I'll go to San Francisco another time. And I ended up exploring Mexico and Guatemala and Belize. you know, in those days of when you're a student, or you don't yet have a full-time job, you're in a sense irresponsible and naive, and it's a wonderful sense to be in. And I kind of aspire to that in my photography in many ways. A few years later, I did finally get to San Francisco. It's a place I always wanted to, and I began to put down roots. It's when I started working for Ruth Bernhard. And then effectively I stayed. I was in San Francisco for over 30 years until I started moving up the coast back to Seattle, the Pacific Northwest, which is where I am now.
Good. Bob Posen, did you have a question? Lynn?
Joys of technology.
I know, that's okay. Well, I think what I'd like to do is sort of end it here. It's been a joy to connect with you again, to talk.
Yes.
And to look forward to your new book coming out. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure all of our listeners did as well. And again, the Fetterman Gallery is your representative, and we are really looking forward to your continued work and to see what comes next.
I love it. Great profession. I feel very fortunate.
So,
thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us. And
thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Now, Peter, you're not drinking wine these days, but I'll drink yours.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Cheers.
you. It was wonderful.
Thank you all.
So much.
And we'll see you
Thanks,
next
Deborah.
week with David Mizell will be our guest next Friday's Artist Winescapes with Artists. So see you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Deborah.
Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.